and welcome back to Community Couch Time, a daily talk show where we talk about things that are important, things that are happening in our community, in our state, in this country, and internationally. Oftentimes, the topics that we discuss are ones that others aren't talking about. And the question is, why aren't we? Hello and welcome back to Community Couch Time. This is Lupe Cardona with a very exciting guest, a really great guerrero from the community, Alejandro Villalpando. And so I'm going to share a little bit about Alejandro before we get started with our interview with him. Alejandro Villalpando is the son of South Central Los Angeles, born to a Maya Quiche Guatemalan immigrant mother and a Mexican immigrant father. He is a father, partner, and educator. He is an assistant professor at California State University, Los Angeles, in the program of Latin American Studies and Department of Pan-African Studies. He holds a PhD in ethnic studies from the University of California, Riverside. Welcome, Alejandro. How are you today?
Good. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for doing this, Lupe. It's such a beautiful offering in such a distinct format. I think that's really invaluable to teaching these kinds of fields and really like learning and absorbing and being community.
Thank you so much, Alejandro. So there's a lot I want to ask you, and I know there's so much to share, such limited time, but I really wanted to kind of ask about your personal connection to the field of Central American studies. Like what is it that brought you to this vibrant, growing field?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So, I had no idea really what I want to do in my life. I graduated undergrad. I went to UC San Diego straight out of high school. I went to Washington Preparatory High School in South Los Angeles or South Central Los Angeles, more specifically like Southwest Los Angeles, right? For people that want to get technical. But and then I went to college, and I initially I had a vision of wanting to be a high school math teacher. I really love math. I took like 6 years of math in high school, or 7 or something. And I excelled at it, and I was really proud of being good at math. And then I went to undergrad at a university that really celebrated and highlighted their engineering program. So the math was really catered towards kind of an engineering background and not necessarily towards education. For a number of reasons that exist that I'm sure students will learn about in this class, right? My educational upbringing in a formal sense wasn't necessarily up to par with what was necessary to transition. In other words, I didn't know how to study. I didn't know how to read. I didn't know how to do anything. I was just good at doing stuff, right? Like I was good at the math part, but all this other stuff, I wasn't really like, I didn't excel as much as I think I could have with the right guidance and training and support and advice. And so when I went to UCSD, which is a pretty high achieving school, it's a pretty like prestigious university, right? Like, not that I care so much about that, but I knew that it was going to be challenging, and it definitely was for me. So I stumbled into a class one day because, again, I didn't have any idea that you could go to an academic advisor. I didn't, I just kind of, I literally would grab the general catalog and be like, oh, look at these classes. I wonder if they offer it. I didn't have a computer, it's just a lot of things that I didn't have, but I did have a history because of how we grew up, which was working poor, working class, that I'm going to figure it out. Like, I have to figure this out. I'm not going to go back, and be a failure. All these heavy thoughts that you don't even think about, right? Like, so there was a class called Latin American Revolutions, right? Or something like that. And it was in the history department. And I was like, wow, let me take that. That sounds cool. So I took that class in my second or third year. I was struggling through math and economics and all these different things just because I didn't know how to study it. Looking back on it now, I know I had a capacity. I just didn't have the support. And I was a pelon, I looked like a cholo from the neighborhood. And people don't be inviting you to their study groups when you look like that, it just was a big culture shock, and so I didn't even know about study groups, but what I'm saying, now I know that people have them. And so anyway, I take this class and I start learning about the Zapatistas, and I start learning about Central American revolutions, right? Like, and I had known that because my family was involved in Guatemala to a pretty serious level, the ones that were left in Guatemala. And yeah, it was really eye-opening, learning about El Salvador and learning about Nicaragua and Guatemala and Honduras and Costa Rica, right? And that these poor, indigenous people, racialized people, working class people dared to resist to the point of, in Nicaragua, taking the state, right? Like that in El Salvador, people were willing to die for their freedom because they weren't tired of being exploited and they were tired of the conditions that were. And then going to Guatemala, my mom being a Maya Quiche woman, right? Learning about that and seeing names that I had seen when I traveled back home, it just really like it really got me, you know. And so over the years I started engaging more. I ended up majoring in history with an emphasis in Latin American and US history, and I just took a great interest in learning about all these different things through history. And then flash forward a few years, I wasn't doing much with my life after that. I mean, I was an educator, but you know, like my journey wasn't complete, and someone in my life at the time asked me one day, you know, it was the summer and we were eating pizza, and you know, I was like I worked in a school year, so I was off in the summer, we're eating pizza at like some restaurant and having like a pitcher of beer or something, and like they're like, what are you doing with your life? And I was like, I'm eating pizza and drinking beer, you know, like on a Friday at noon, like this is pretty cool. And they're like, nah, I thought you were gonna go back to school. And I was like, why are you bringing up old stuff, you know? And then but that comment really resonated with me, right? Like, because it felt like it was someone that at the time really cared about me and was asking me like, I know this isn't it for you. And so I started looking at programs. I looked at UCLA, I looked at Latin American Studies at Cal State LA, and they had a master's program. I had no idea about a PhD at that time. You know, there was nothing. But they had a class in the course selection, and one of the classes was Central American experiences in the US. And I was like, oh, that just like it did something to me. And I was like, I'm gonna apply here and I'm gonna go here. And I went there and I got some support, some guidance, some really wonderful you know, shout out to Dr. Vergara, shout out to Dr. Acevedo, Dr. Ochoa, Dr. Baker, you know, all these wonderful folks who really guided me and believed in me and invested their time in me and guided me to, you know, winning scholarships and kind of demystifying or like taking away the scary parts of what a PhD sounds like, right? And so I went to get a PhD in ethnic studies at UCR and really was able to advance a project that was meaningful to me. And I think that what makes my work distinct and my visions and my analytical frames are being indigenous, growing up in South Central to a working class, working poor family during a time of heightened violence because of the war on drugs. And then also because I am a student of ethnic studies, right? And so that inflects, it shapes, it impacts, it leaves a deep imprint in what I see Central American studies being, right? And I think it's a praxis to kind of invite people to think about the history of valiant resistors and resilient peoples that continue to fight to this day over 530 years. And also to kind of depict the horrors and the extension that the US and global capitalist interests have had in countries that they feel like they own,
Right.
that chauvinism, right? Like I think that Central America and Central American studies is US history.
Right.
And the fact that people may hear that for the first time and think, what? That has nothing to do with anything. That shows me that we have a lot of work to do. So all of that really excites me. And it continues to impact all the work that I do as an activist, as an organizer, as an educator, as a community member. I really highlight those things. I try to bridge the experiences and share the histories of Central Americans to my community of South Central and communities that I have affinity to, like Compton. So we really do. The point of Central American Studies for me is to like also bring it outside of the university in spaces like this where all kinds of people can listen to this. So thank you for doing that. So I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Yeah, no, it really does answer the question really well. And I noticed also some overlap in kind of the trajectory of like how you got into Central American studies. And also for me, I majored in Latin American studies and the Chicano studies at UCLA, but I got in as a different major, and I realized like they weren't really teaching about, you know, Mexico or Central America, Latin America in general, or really like I got in as a art history major, and I was noticing that the art history that they were incorporating was very Eurocentric. And I'm like, I want to really learn more about like, you know, my these countries here, my people here, and internationally. So it's kind of interesting how that happens, where you find yourself, you know, maybe you don't know that you're on that path, but you find yourself on that path with time. So specifically like with Central American studies, so if there are folks out there who are, really wanting to pursue an education in Central American studies, like what are some really important topics that that Central American scholars are studying or involved in currently? I know you kind of spoke to it a little bit right now, but what are some that folks out there can learn more about?
I think one of the really exciting things that's occurring in Central American studies is the kind of desire and the commitment that scholars have to attend to the lack of attention historically, scholarly, popularly, to Black and Indigenous communities of Central America. Central America, for those of you that don't know, is a rich, diverse isthmus made up of 7 countries. Oftentimes, people only consider Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, right? Especially in the recent years with the previous administration, the focus on refugees, asylum seekers, and caravans, right? Where a lot of these folks were coming from there. But even in those 3 countries, there's a rich diversity, right? Like a home of diverse Blackness, right? Like, for example, in Central America, like when we think about Blackness in the United States, we also reduce it and limit it, right? Like Blackness in South Central is the same as Blackness in like, Alabama. And it's not. Like the Black experience is distinct. There are overlaps, obviously, right? And so Blackness in Central America is very distinct, right? Like you have Afro-Indigenous people, you have the descendants of enslaved Africans, you have the descendants of West Indian migrants who came to work developing the railroad system and came to work on banana plantations and other sugar plantations as immigrant workers, right? You have stories of African Americans migrating down to Central America in the mid 1800s, right? So when I say, right, like there's a huge diversity, and then the indigenous populations, right, which include some Afro-Indigenous populations, they're so diverse, right? People may think of the Maya, right, but there's the Nawa, there's there's why am I drawing a blank? There's the Garifuna, there's the Xinca, there's the I'm trying to think of the other folks. There's the Mosquito in Nicaragua, right? There's the Rama people. There's just so many different groups, right? Like so many different histories that are distinct and unique. And that's really diverse. And then there's the class and gender dynamics, right? One of the things that I think is also really brilliant, and a new generation of queer Central American studies scholars. And really, when I say scholars, I don't mean just people with PhDs, right? I mean students that are literally shaping the field and impacting things, community members that are shaping and impacting the field, right? So queer and trans people that are really pushing the boundaries and saying, don't forget us, because they're some of the most vulnerable people, right? Like, and still the role of patriarchy and femicide in the isthmus is one of deadly consequences, just like it is all over the world. So when we think about these things, right, like those are all like really heavy topics, right? Like really intense ones. The other part is that we have to celebrate the folks and the organizations and the community members and the communities that rise up and resist and dare to like question the order of things, that this is somehow okay, right? They flee, for example, in my opinion, right, like trans Central American femmes, right, like trans Central American women, or people in transition, gender non-binary folks who may not call themselves that but don't fit gender binaries as we think of it, right, migrating and leaving and seeking asylum in the United States and Spain and Canada and Australia or wherever, right? Like, to me, that's a refusal to accept a fate that is marked by patriarchy. Yeah. And I think that to write about that, right, to think about that, to sit and listen to the words of trans folks, of trans liberation folks that are coming from Central America who are telling you their story. It's not just their story. The story is about, pointing to power and history and the things that we should find unacceptable. And if we find them unacceptable, then we need to refuse them. And when we refuse them, that means we need to build a world again that is not predicated on those things. And I think trans vulnerable folks, right, like, Black folks and Central American Indigenous folks, they already do that. They've been doing that, right? And I think it's time for scholars to listen. And I think as more Central American people from diverse class, racial, gender, sexual orientation backgrounds, right, like all that is just gonna like give the field more edges, more texture, right, and more complexity. Because for a long time the field was dominated by white scholars writing about Central America, and then a long time, mostly mestizo folks writing about very important things, right? Like when I think the field is ready to, and is already in the process of evolving. So, just that right now, what I just shared is different and distinct, I think, than what other folks would answer. But I think that that's what's really exciting about this, and if students are interested, there's some folks who are writing from the isthmus, right? People that people should be listening to, like Miriam Miranda from Honduras, who is a Garifuna leader of Frane. There is Pablo Lopez, Joseph Lopez Oro out of Smith College, who is Afro-Honduran and writes about queer Garifuna people in New York. There's Nicole Ramsey, who is from Los Angeles originally and is writing about Belizean experiences and transnational identity making. There's indigenous scholars, Irma Alicia Matush, I think is their last name, but she's a celebrated scholar and theorist, Maya Quiche woman. There's my dear friend and colleague Floridalma Boj Lopez here at UCLA in Chicano Studies and Central American Studies, who does wonderful work about transnational Mayan identity through weaving, right, and the maintenance of that. And so how not to slip up and like try to be caught up into like I'm a multicultural whatever, like, and I make up, right? And she's like, nah, man, like, don't like try to come in and add to the diversity of this country. Like, tell the people why you're here, right? And as an indigenous woman, I'm here because you people didn't allow me to stay in my ancestral lands, and that's not cool, bro. So like it's stuff like that comes from real beautiful like backgrounds. And to me, what the most important thing about any kind of ethnic studies is people from those impacted communities that have those experiences, who are finally are being able to articulate some of those experiences. And they're not just like storytelling like for the sake of storytelling, right? Like they're storytelling to analyze power, to tell us, to disrupt the order of things, right? And that's what I think that these fields do. They invite people to be welcomed in the field, to like, oh, that's interesting. My dad was like this.
Right.
And that happens a lot in the classroom, especially with all students, really. It's not just Central American students, right? Like, because then you have some Mexican students, Black students. I've had one time I had this Korean student. She was a nursing student. And she was like, I work with a lot of Salvadorans at my job at the hospital. I had no idea that this is what they go through. And so now I'm able to have these conversations, and we have overlap with Korean diasporas. So, it's just beautiful to share. And then you start to build new solidarities and bridges, and I think that that's really important. And sometimes the conversations are uncomfortable, but I don't think that that's bad either,
No, not at all. Yeah. In fact, I'm going to be interviewing your partner, Susie, in a couple of days. And that was actually one of the conversations that we had before. Is for me as a teacher, teaching these things, I'm able to kind of get to the heart of some of these uncomfortable moments, these uncomfortable histories, these uncomfortable times where we weren't in solidarity, where maybe there was actually like, power that created like dehumanizing conditions within our communities that we need to work through and overcome, so that we can build that solidarity. And that can be painful, that can expose trauma. And Susie, that's what she deals with, is that trauma. So we're kind of talking about how like working together through how to be able to facilitate that in the classroom, but at the same time be responsible about how we then take our students to that next level of healing is really, right, really important. You shared so much, like you touched on a lot of the things that I was actually going to ask you, specifically, like that ethnic solidarity is so important. And then also I really wanted you to kind of talk to folks out there about the field of Central American studies, and if they're interested in it, their place, like where can we see this next generation coming and growing Central American studies?
Yeah, I will say that for those students who are like, I know, I teach at Costa de Ley, so our students, I hardly ever get majors, or like minors in Central American Studies. Central American Studies is actually a very small, formalized field, right? So what that means is that there is, or I guess institutionalized, right? So there's only 2 Central American Studies bachelor's degree granting institutions, I think, in the United States. They happen to be here in LA. And that makes sense, right? Because this LA is the central hub for the diaspora of Central American people. I would imagine that Los Angeles has the highest number of Guatemalans living outside of Guatemala City. Los Angeles has the highest number of Salvadorans living outside of San Salvador, which are the capitals of those two countries. It probably has one of the highest concentrations of Hondurans living outside of Tegucigalpa or San Pedro Sula, two of their major cities. It probably has one of the highest numbers of Panameños, and specifically Afro-Panameños living outside of Panama, and Belizeans as well, right? So on and so forth, right? All those countries where there's been a lot of movement, right? Like Los Angeles is a hub, right? But Central Americans also landed in places like Houston, Miami, Washington, D.C. There's a significant population, I heard, in somewhere in Michigan, right, of Guatemaltecos, you know, San Francisco, Washington, Portland, you know, like it's just, people went and these trajectories and these lines of where people come from, they follow like where there was solidarity hubs, right? Like a lot of sanctuary people that push for sanctuary and safety for these unofficial refugees, right? They were never recognized as officially as refugees, and that's in purpose because the United States was creating the conditions that they were running from. Right, like through their funding of their government. So for the United States to say like, yeah, you're in danger, then you're saying like, oh damn, I'm like helping the homies I'm helping over there, the homies being like dictators and fascists in Central America are actually killing their own people. That's why they're coming in thousands and thousands of numbers, right? So it maps that like people came to where there's these like hubs of like people, churches, you know, and a lot of times it was white churches, white-led churches, you know, that were doing this work to be in solidarity, you know. And you know, some of the ugly parts are like that, for example, in Texas, you know, like in Texas and Houston, a lot of Mexican Americans, a lot of Mexican Tejanos, they were not having it. Right, like they were protesting again. I mean, you know, it happened here too, right? It's happened now. So you know, that those are the ugly parts, right? Like where people see these people as not the same. But so I share all of that, right? Because I think one of the places for people is what I like about Central American studies, or at least how I define it, right? Like, or not define it, it's undefinable and it's so vast, right? And so that like the study of Central America can be done through a lecture, a conversation, a book, or you can go out in the community and go to a parade and kind of just sit and ask questions or observe and then kind of go Google and do some research, right? For example, I will say, and I want to shout out, sometime in September in Compton at Patria Coffee, a coffee shop that is owned by an Afro Mestizo Guatemalan person, we're trying to organize a screening of a documentary that is 20 years of work done by a director who is from Costa Rica, who is a DJ, on the budding Central American graffiti and hip hop movement.
Oh, so dope.
Right. And so, you know, I can share the trailer with you and all of that. And
I'll put it in the comment section.
It's amazing to me. That Central American studies, right? And so the reason, you know, I'm helping to coordinate that particular showing, to do it in a place like Compton and to unite these communities, right? Compton is Black, right? Like, even though there's mad numbers, right? Like the numbers and the demographics have shifted, but Compton in the popular imagination never ceases to be Black, right? A Black space. And so with that comes a rich history of how Black folks have fought for inclusion and representation and political rights and human rights, and have impacted the culture of Compton. These non-Black Central American folks and Black Central American folks, because there's a robust history of an Afro-Panamanian community in Compton, right? Shout out to my homegirl, Jenise, who wrote a book called The Boulevard on her experiences being Afro-Panameña. The Boulevard, you know, it's a great book. We taught it. It's a short a chapbook, poetry book, and short vignettes, and it just takes you there, you know? But to unite hip hop, right? Like this very hip hop is an Afro-diasporic, right? Like cultural production, right? Like a site of resistance for Black folks from all over the world, especially the Caribbean and the United States, right? And the fact that that language and that culture has taken root in other places like Central America to become a vehicle, right? Like for resistance and expression after genocidal war, right? Is to me, wow, what a connection, right? And so I feel like someone like myself who does this work, comes from communities like these, is uniquely positioned to bridge that conversation, right? To like take some of these threads that look loose and then intertwine them together and braid them into something else, right? Like as an offering. Now people can disagree and want to unbraid them, that's fine.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that that's one of the ways that how people can get involved is like, look for events, cultural events, go eat food, you know, like go ask questions about the food, you know, like our horchatas are different between Mexicanos, right? Like some Mexican areas and Central America, right? The reason is because a lot of the horchata that is produced in Central America, especially in places like El Salvador and in Honduras, right? It's more based on kind of these traditional West African drinks that were brought over and have survived, right? Like, so, you know, there's just so much of that richness that I think that's to me, that sounds like if I was I was a 19-year-old kid looking for direction in life and grounding. And to me, Central American studies can give that to anyone, right? Like, and be like, dang, these people have gone through so much recently. Recently, right? Like not a long time ago, and they're still here and they're advancing. And there's of course like brilliant success stories, right? Like in all these individual things, but like I love the stories of just like, you know, a Black Honduran mother who refused to like let her child starve and dared to walk thousands of miles to cross the border and try to get asylum in the United States. Like I think that story is amazing.
Yeah.
Right?
I have chills, and I really want to say thank you so much for sharing all of that. And I know that we could probably sit here for like a week straight and barely even touch the surface of it. But I just want you to know, and I want folks out there to know that that this is a beautiful solidarity. I'm so proud to be a part of this movement, and I'm so open to learn more. Like I know from my own self, being, you know, a young 18, 19-year-old, I was already a mom. I was already on the trajectory to, you know, to have like a different life, like not a life of higher education and becoming a professional. But, you know, finding myself in the curriculum and finding that relevancy saved my life. But now I feel like my life is becoming more whole and more rich with learning more about my relatives, you know, that have come from other parts of, you know, Mexico and Central America and beyond. And I feel like it's such a beautiful gift. Thank you so much for helping. And I'm going to be putting a list of all the books that you recommended. And I know that you have a whole array of, because I've seen your Instagram where you share quite often books that folks can read. I'm going to put that in the comments. I'm going to put the trailer out. I definitely want to support with that event. So please keep me connected, and I'll keep the students connected with that event at Patria Coffee.
I love that. And if there's an opportunity to screen it at your place, let me know if there's a way, because they're looking to do a tour and I want to support them and do networking like that.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about that, because definitely with some of the other things that I do outside of the classroom, we can definitely make that happen. And
can I just say one more thing for folks? Is I want folks to understand, right? Like Central Americans also have like you know, experiences that are unique, right? And I think it's important to remember them. So like I want to say justice for Andres Guardado, who was killed unjustly and brutally in Gardena, California by Compton sheriffs, by two Latinx officers who are were allegedly trying to join the executioner's deputy clique out of Compton Sheriff Station. So justice for Andres Guardado, a young Salvadoran 18-year-old kid who has beautiful parents, beautiful siblings, beautiful niece. Shout out to that beautiful family who has gone through an unspeakable act of violence, and they had already gone through an unspeakable act of violence because they had to flee a war-torn country only to come to lose their loved one. And that is why I fight, and that's why I think about the geographies of anti-Black policing and how it impacts our communities, Central American communities, and why we need to continue to do the work that Lupe is talking about, is build those ethnic and racial solidarities against state violence, to build another world outside of capitalism and that exploitation. And that is like my place in Central American studies and what I try to do, so everyone find their place. And again, justice for Andres Guardado.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you, everyone, and Ilakech.
Thank you.
Wow, Alejandro shared some powerful insights on Central American studies and community issues. I'm so very thankful that folks like Alejandro and the community organizers, authors, and scholars he shared with us are doing what they do to transform conditions and the quality of life for our Central American relatives. And so for today, your community couch time discussion is that I'd like for you to do further research on some of the topics or the persons that he shared with us today. What work is being done, and how can folks out there get involved?
Thank you all, and in Lakesh.